Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Paul Geduldig, and I have the privilege of serving as the CEO of the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco. On behalf of the JCC, it's my honor to welcome you all this evening for our program, Israel Since October 7th, with Yossi Klein Halevi and Krista Tippett. The JCC, as you may know, has been a part of the beautiful tapestry of San Francisco for almost 150 years. We are urban and inclusive. We create spaces where people of all ages, backgrounds, and identities can find a place for lifelong learning, friendship, and sense of community. If you've been in our building before, you know for decades, we've run preschools, summer camps, fitness and swim lessons, social connection for older adults, and through programs like this, our arts and culture programming, our holiday celebrations, and educational programs, we celebrate and explore Jewish culture and traditions as a pathway for joyful and meaningful living. That being said, we find ourselves in an extremely difficult moment. Since the terrorist attacks of October 7th, and with the ensuing war in Israel and Gaza, there's been a sense of shock and concern and grief. In some cases, this has brought us closer together. And for some, it has had them felt called to reconnect to or to explore Jewish identity. In other ways, this moment has exposed wide differences that have probably been growing within our community for many years. We are witnessing also an alarming rise of anti-Semitism, and many Jews are once again feeling an uncomfortable sense of vulnerability and isolation. So this pivotal moment calls on the JCC to take a look in the mirror again and to ask ourselves to deeply consider what our role and responsibility is at this time. One of the ways that we do that is through programs like this evening. We bring experts and thought leaders to guide us in understanding and navigating these critical times. Some of our recent guests have included Dalia Scheinlin, Noah Feldman, Sheryl Sandberg, and Rabbi Sharon Brous. The JCC has also been showing up by providing opportunities for connection and community. Recent events included a joyous Jewish-Moroccan end of Passover Memuna celebration with Jemena, a Yom HaShoah commemoration in partnership with JFCS's Holocaust Center, and a special and somber Yom HaZikaron memorial service in Hebrew to serve the local Israeli community. This past Sunday, we presented an amazing performance, a first ever theater piece written and produced by Asian Jews. Coming in June, we look forward to a conversation on June 4th with Tom Steyer, a renowned investor and activist. I believe he also ran for president. And he'll be talking to us about how we can all fight climate change, knowledgeably, joyfully, and even profitably, at a time of unparalleled consequence and opportunity. Also, please save the date for, we've coined the term Erev Juneteenth. That's on June 18th, the night before Juneteenth, for a celebration of freedom centering on the voices of Black Jews, honoring this 150-year-old holiday through a Jewish lens. Join us for a special program commemorating the emancipation of enslaved African Americans through food, conversation, and music. And it's going to be a special program that includes a delicious meal prepared by Michael Twitty, who is a James Beard and National Jewish Book Award winning chef. Just a few moments of gratitude. So first, our sincerest thanks to the Shalom Hartman Institute and the Koret Foundation for their partnership, their friendship, and their support in bringing Yossi to the Bay Area for tonight's program and other programs. Also, as we exit, you'll see there are some delicious cookies by Jane the Baker. We always give a shout out for her delicious cookies. I want to thank the JCCSF staff who make programs like this and all the things that we do each and every day that make us shine. Thank you. We have several board members, past and present. I'm always grateful to you for your leadership, your wise counsel, and your time. And there are many donors here too. We are a nonprofit organization. We wouldn't be able to do this work without you. So if you are a donor, we are very grateful. We thank you. And if you're not yet a donor, think about it. Last, I want to thank you all for coming out and being here tonight, for coming to learn, wrestle with engaging and sometimes challenging topics, and for recognizing that there's a real human need and a spiritual necessity for being together in person and in community with each other. Two last pieces of housekeeping. One, before I turn the mic over to our guests. One is, after Yossi and Krista's conversation, we will open it up to questions from you, but the way we're going to do that is you should have received an index card. If you have not received one, you can raise your hand and a staff person will bring one to you. You can write your question and pass it to your right, and we'll collect them about halfway through the shows, and we'll collate them, and those that we can read, so please write legibly, we will be happy to share. And we appreciate your help with that. And then the last thing, you'll notice all the seats are facing this way. That's because these are the guests that we've invited to speak tonight. So I want to ask you, please, that any guests who are found causing a disruption during the program, you may be asked to leave by our professional security team. We do want your presence, we want your questions, we want your participation, but without interruption or disturbance. So, hope that makes sense. We appreciate your respect for the JCC, our community, and the invited guests. And with that, on to the program. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Together with Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University, he co-directed the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative to teach emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. His 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year award. His latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a New York Times bestseller. He writes for leading op-ed pages in the US, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and is a former contributing editor to the New Republic. Born in Brooklyn, he moved to Israel in 1982 and lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, who runs a center for Jewish meditation. They have 3 children. Appearing with Yossi this evening is one of my absolute all-time favorite podcasters, Krista Tippett. Krista Tippett is a Peabody-award winning broadcaster, National Humanities Medalist, and New York Times bestselling author. She created and hosts On Being, which has won the highest honors in broadcast, internet, and podcasting. Emerging in 2024 is the Lab for the Art of Living, gatherings and quiet conversations to accompany the generative people and possibilities within this tender, tumultuous time to be alive. That's a very Krista Tippett sentence. Krista grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, attended Brown University, worked as a young journalist and diplomat in Cold War Berlin, and later received a Master's of Divinity from Yale. Her books are Speaking of Faith, Einstein's God, and most recently, Becoming Wise, an inquiry into the mystery and art of living. So with that, friends, please join me in giving a warm JCC welcome to Yossi Klein Halevi and Krista Tippett.
I'm using a handheld mic, old-fashioned way. I'm so happy to be here. It's lovely to see all of you. I want to thank the JCC of San Francisco for creating this event. I am, first of all, was really honored to be invited to have this conversation tonight, to be invited to hold this conversation in this room tonight. And I asked the people at the JCC what their hopes and aspirations were for this evening, and I so appreciated the response that this would be an opportunity for people to gain some compassion, insight, and understanding into the Israeli psyche and spiritual health today, and what Yossi, a former Diaspora-Israeli Jew, sees as its future. And of course, all of that also wanders into the meaning of Israel in the lives of American Jews. I'm very aware as a kind of journalist-adjacent person that what gets voluminous, overwhelming coverage, understandably perhaps, are terrible unfolding dramas of violence and war and protest and politics, death, and all of that is in this room with us tonight. What doesn't get well covered by journalism, even at the best of times, is the full, complex reality of human pain that underlies and is all around these stories, what is happening in the human psyche and heart, the complex matter of life writ large, what isn't encompassed in the coverage, and what we scarcely have it in us to dwell with are geologic layers of complexity, particularly of this place of Israel, this people, these peoples, this history, these histories, how the drama of the Holy Land is in some ways a crucible of the drama of humanity. You said to me once, Yossi, that Jerusalem is a place where the essential human story plays itself out with particular intensity, sometimes excruciating intensity. We scarcely know how to ask of these stories that come at us, where is the spiritual in all of this? And that's what we're going to try to hold some reverence before tonight. Hold a reverence also before what we can meaningfully approach with words and what we can't right now. And I am grateful to be with Yossi. I said to you, in all these months since October 7th, there's no one I have longed to be in conversation with you.
It's very mutual.
You were the person I wanted to speak with. And I have interviewed Yossi 3 times, and there may be just 1 or 2 other people I've interviewed 3 times. I don't go back. But we have had this kind of odyssey of conversation, and part of the arc of this is going to be reliving that, because, something I want to say, first of all, I want to spend a little bit of time introducing your life trajectory and your spiritual trajectory, because it's a seedbed of how you are living in this moment, inhabiting this moment. And something I've always so admired about Yossi is, and found our conversation so exhilarating and challenging, is you are always stretching and evolving and growing and searching. And I actually first interviewed you in early 2002. I think it may have been kind of 1 year after 9/11. You grew up, and we spoke a lot about, how you grew up in Brooklyn. I didn't hear the introduction. I don't know if maybe you heard this, but the son of a Holocaust survivor. Your father was a survivor from Hungary who survived the war by living in a hole in the forest. And you have written, or you said to me, I would say that hole was the prism through which I was raised to see the world. Would you say something about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you all, and especially delighted and honored to be with you, Krista. And there is no one that I would rather be having this conversation with than you, and I frankly adore you. So I'm just really... So that hole that my father lived in was really in many ways it was the metaphor that I carried growing up. In so many ways, my Hebrew name, Yosef, Joseph, I thought of Joseph in the pit, biblical Joseph, and it wasn't conscious. It's something that I realized only much later. But I identified so powerfully with the biblical figure Joseph, not only because we had the same name, but because my father shared the same space. And so there was really this sense that I had growing up of Jewish history beginning in one pit and almost ending in another. And that hole was the prism, or prison, actually, through which I viewed the non-Jewish world. And this is how I was raised by my father, that the world is divided between 2 kinds of non-Jews, those who actively want to destroy the Jews, and those who are secretly glad that others are doing the work. And when I got older, I started thinking back to the another detail of the story of the whole, which didn't quite fit into that breakdown of humanity. There was a forest keeper, a Christian forest keeper, who brought him food and who kept him alive. And my father made sure that I not only knew that story, but he made sure that I knew the name of this forest keeper. And I think his intention was to try to, in some ways, subvert this black and white narrative about the world that he was telling me. But this experience was so overwhelming for him that he could only convey it in the starkest way possible. But he planted in me this question, oh, well, maybe he's not quite right about how the world is structured. And so my growing up was really growing out of the whole.
Although, I mean, it seems as though when you were a young man, a teenager, a young adult man, that story of the Jews as a besieged, pursued, hated people led you followed that narrative, and you were full of rage, and you went towards this militant quasi-terrorist Jewish Defense League and got very close to violence.
It took me a long time to get out of that hole.
Okay.
And it's interesting because I stopped for many years. I stopped writing about my experience on the Jewish far right, and I stopped writing about my father and his Holocaust experience. And now I'm coming full circle and going back to that story. I'm working on a book which is really about that for all kinds of reasons. One is that the far right is suddenly not a part of American Jewish folklore anymore. Meir Kahane is having his historical moment. And what is happening in Israel today is something that I feel in some sense implicated in, because I was present unknowingly at the birth of this monstrous distortion of Judaism. And it began in Brooklyn with the generation right after the Holocaust in the late 1960s, with all the good reasons. It was America of the 60s and the rage and the culture, and this was our equivalent. But I look back on that, and I say, we created the ground for what's now happening in Israel.
Wow, that's I mean, this is a whole new evolution from the conversations we've been having.
Yeah.
These 20 years, actually.
Right.
And when I first interviewed you in 2002, it was really spiritual awakening. It was actually going very deeply into Judaism that pulled you out of the hole.
Right.
And you moved to Israel and you became a journalist. And when I spoke with you, you had just written this beautiful, hopeful book, At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, A Jew's Search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land. I still believe that this is one of the most important spiritual memoirs I've ever read. The publication date was September 11th, 2001. So it did not really get the publicity it deserved.
You're the only one still talking about it.
I will always talk about it. And also, the terrible irony is that by the time you and I spoke, because this was written, that Yossi, who was out of the hole, who was spiritually awakened, was so full of hope in the days of Oslo. And by the time we spoke, by the time the book was published, when we were speaking, suicide bombings were targeting buses and cafes in Israeli cities.
And now we're at a higher turn of that spiral.
Now we're what? At the
higher turn of that spiral.
Right. And I interviewed you again in 2006 for a series we did, which we called Two Narratives. And I had one, and the fight I had to have in public radio, I don't know if I ever told you this, but was to say, we are going to have 1 hour that is just an Israeli voice. And 1 hour that is just Palestinian voices, we're not going to pretend like if we put the voices together in an hour, we've created balance. And that, for me was such an education. And of course, this is so very much alive now in such an extremely dramatic way of a shared history, a lived history where one man's independence is another man's catastrophe, and one person's hero is another person's terrorist, and one man's emigrant is another's refugee, and that this is what I wrote at the time. I look back at the script I wrote. This was kind of my understanding, and so you correct me if this is not nuanced enough, but these are not merely contrasts of vocabulary, but of experience, imagination, and possibility, and that they stand as fiercely as much as any enmity or violence between these two peoples and any possibility of sustainable peace. Did you want to? I think so much about the two narratives in this moment.
It's impossible for me to feel empathy, not for Palestinian suffering. That's something that I'm trying to keep myself open to and not to freeze, because I'd say most of Israeli society is frozen right now. But I'm trying to not shield myself from the devastation that we're inflicting, and that I believe we have no choice but to inflict, but that means that I have to own it. I have to own the disaster of Gaza, because it's not only happening in my name, but I support this war. And so that's one piece of it. The other piece is that I'm really in my Israeli instincts, very mainstream, very ordinary. And the rage that almost the entire Israeli Jewish population feels still. And that includes most of the Israeli left. And
At October 7th.
About October 7th. And for Israeli Jews, it is still October 7th. For all kinds of reasons, because for the hostages, it's still October 7th. And October 7th you were speaking about trauma before, and October 7th was an existential threat to Israel's most basic self-understanding as a safe refuge for the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And October 7th destroyed that covenant that Israel made with the Jewish people. And, we're a society that sent commandos halfway across Africa to Entebbe Airport in 1976 to rescue 100 Israeli hostages. We couldn't save 1,200 of our fellow Israelis within the borders of the state of Israel. Now that's a trauma that we are going to carry at least for this generation. And, I'm very, very wary of entering into this identity of victimhood and self-pity. And it's true that on October 7th, we had a momentary lapse into Jewish victimhood, but that lasted one day. And on October 8th, almost the entirety of the Israeli Jewish population made a decision, which is we're not going to allow victimhood to stand. And Israelis used to say that we would rather be hated than pitied. Be careful what you ask for, but that is the Israeli ethos. And what that means, though, is we need to own the consequences of power, which is moral responsibility. And also, when you assume power, you have no right to consider yourself a victim. But I also don't believe that the critique of much of the world toward Israel is right. I don't believe that we're victimizers. I think we're acting in Gaza the way any country would in our place.
Okay, I want to come back to that in just a minute. I want to, just finish this little trajectory of our conversation. We also met in 2011 at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and I met your family, and I also, you just spoke of the freezing, and you're also describing like physiological processes that happen inside a human body when threat is present. I actually wanted to plant, before we keep going, I wanted to plant this in, I have been struck by conversations I've had, how I've felt, the correspondence I had with the people here at the JCC, the words that come up again and again in terms of how people are feeling standing before what's happening. Sad, anxious, sleepless, afraid, terrified, in pain, in despair, heartbreaking, heartbroken. And I wanted to ask you, kind of close to the beginning of this conversation, how is your heart? And I guess I would like to plant all of us in that question, because it's the thing that gets skipped over.
Yeah.
I almost hear you saying that it may be hard for you to feel these things right now.
Yeah. It's easier to feel compassion for Palestinian suffering, although that's complicated too, because I'm causing it. I'm causing it, and I own it. And I had a very Eastern moment last night, and I think it was in preparation for this conversation. I suddenly said, you don't have to carry this anguish all the time. And you can be faithful to this Jewish moment, and you can try to hold as much of the complexity of this moment as possible, but you're not obligated to be carrying this. And it was really an extraordinary moment, and I don't know how long it lasted. But
What did you call it? An Eastern moment?
it was an Eastern moment.
It was a contemplative moment.
It was, and I really, and then I said, I was going to speak to Krista tomorrow. This is a preparation, and so and I really think so. I really do think that it was this wonderful, fleeting experience, but. I mean, my heart is broken in many ways. One is seeing Israel shattered, but the truth is my Israeli heart was broken over the last year and a half.
Right.
Before October 7th.
Right.
And after October 7th, and Israeli society miraculously pulled together, I felt this kind of relief. The anguish that I felt leading up to October 7th was that Israel was destroying itself. This was entirely self-inflicted. We had a coalition of the absolute worst elements of Israeli society. It's as if Netanyahu deliberately sought the worst people in the state of Israel and gave them ministries. And I was very involved in the democracy movement.
Yeah.
And so my heart was broken already for the last year and a half. And October 7th has broken it in a different way. It's the multiple layers of suffering that just feels endless on both sides. And I understand that. How deeply I feel that, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm also asking about your heartbreak over October 7th, right? All of it. That idea, sorry, go on.
No, just what someone said to me we were looking at some Israeli art, and it was very kind of joyful. And she said, that Israel is finished. And I realized she was right. The Israel that we have known until October 7th, which was an extraordinary experiment in Jewish joy. Israel, really, we famously, we scored in the top 10 of the UN Happiness Index of Nations. And, it was such a mystery. Like, how is that possible? Israelis constantly complain, we're such a miserable people. And yet we're like number 5 or 6. And so I think it had something to do with this feeling of being part, just being an Israeli gave us a feeling of purpose, of uplift. Mm-hmm. And most of us felt that. Mm-hmm. And there's this wonderful line in an old Israeli song about the ingathering of the Jewish people back into the land. This is the great adventure of our lives. And what I love about that line is how personal it is, and how true it was. And when I moved to Israel, I wanted to participate in the great adventure.
Of you, that is what I know of you.
Yes, this is wow, I could actually be part of that. Yeah. And so what broke for me is the end of that kind of innocence. I mean, Israel was never an innocent place, but there was a
also not relaxing.
Not relaxing, not relaxing. But there was this sense of, we're living kind of the happy ever after story of the Jews, and that's gone. Mm-hmm. That's the heartbreak.
Mm-hmm. You wrote in July 2023, you wrote this piece called "The Wounded Jewish Psyche and the Divided Israeli Soul."
Before October 7th. Before October 7th.
Before October 7th in July. And it's 3 a.m. in Jerusalem these days. That is not an unusual time for me to be awake. Like many Israelis, I have become a political insomniac. The disruption of sleep is a small reflection of the dread so many of us feel for the long-term viability of the Jewish state. You also wrote, and I want to circle back to what you were talking about with power and the really massive disconnect between how Israelis see themselves and how others see them. You said, what is being fought in Israel today is at once a practical struggle over democratic institutions and norms, and a theological struggle over the meaning of Zionism and Jewish history. Was the purpose of Zionism to free us from the ghetto, or simply to arm it, to allow our wounds to heal, or to indulge them?
I don't even know how to respond to those words post-October 7th.
That you wrote, yeah. But, so one thing a conversation that I've been having and listening in on is, and I really want to know what you think about this idea that so like something else you've written is that the root, this was in November 2023, perhaps the most enduring wound for Jews from the Holocaust is the memory of aloneness. As we struggle to absorb the enormity of the October 7th massacre and to confront a global wave of anti-Semitism, the trauma of aloneness has returned. And it seems to me, and again in conversation with Jewish friends, this is alive for Israelis. And yet the world sees Israel as powerful. Right? And even in this question you asked, what is the purpose of Zionism, to free us from the ghetto or to arm it, to allow our wounds to heal or to indulge them? Is there a wound that Israel itself has yet to tend in this root trauma of aloneness, of Israel actually physically, the creation of the modern state of Israel, being a last refuge. And then this kind of secular Zionism, that narrative that Israeli, that the Jewish people took their fate in their hands. And does that, in a way, has that, in fact, not allowed Israelis to really admit to the fullness of the trauma? The reality of this persecuted, ravaged people who had no place else to go just to stay alive. Because the trauma is not seen right now in the rest of the world. But the trauma is what you are living and reliving. And I just think of October 7th as like blasting through geologic layers of trauma.
Yes, yeah. And I think that Israel and the Jewish people is caught in this kind of pathological loop where so many Jews feel themselves, and Israelis, which is astonishing, feel themselves again as victims, while much of the world sees us as victimizers. And neither of those categories are useful in understanding Israel.
And there's also a sense in which Israel doesn't seem to, yes, here you heard what I just said and how I see the trauma, and it also seems that Israel has trouble admitting to its own power in a sense.
Yes,
which complicates the perceptions on the outside.
Yes, which is also why I don't believe we should indulge our trauma. We are inflicting an enormous amount of trauma on our neighbors. And we have to, again, we have to own that. And owning that means you don't have the right to be a victim. Now, there are other options between victim and victimizer.
Yeah.
And we are very powerful and vulnerable. We all woke up on October 8th, Israelis and diaspora Jews, realizing that we were much less safe than we thought we were. Mm-hmm. We're not used to inhabiting the psychological space of power and vulnerability. And that's where we are as a people. It's
almost like for all this complexity of the history, both of those things are difficult to own.
Yeah, and I love your description of layers of trauma. I would just add one word, layers of unresolved trauma. Mm-hmm. And that really is the Israeli psyche. We've brought back Jews from around the world who came as traumatized refugees. Yeah. It's not only the Jews from the Holocaust, it's the Jews from the Middle East. Yeah. It's the Jews from Ethiopia. More Jews proportionally died on the way to Israel from Ethiopia than any other Jewish community. And we've never, as a society, we've never confronted that. And I know Ethiopian Jews, and it is a deeply traumatized community whose wound is hidden from the rest of Israel. So there are so many multiple layers of wound there. And this is before we get to October 7th. Yeah. And I don't know what we're going to do with this. I don't know I'm terrified of the political consequences of October 7th. And at the same time, I'm actually hopeful of the spiritual consequences. Because I think that Israelis are at that point of desperation where they're going to have to start asking themselves basic spiritual questions. Is there a meaning to this life? Is there anything more than what the five senses can perceive? And Israel today, I think, is ripe for a spiritual transformation.
Oh, that's so interesting. I made a bunch of notes looking back at, especially at the conversations we had. It's one of the things you said, one of the points you made right at the beginning at the entrance to the Garden of Eden, is that one of the critical failures of the Oslo Accords was that it tried to impose a peace of secular elites on a region whose language and instincts are religious.
Yeah, and the disaster of October 7th is that this was done in the name of God. And the disaster of this Israeli government is that this is our first explicitly religious government. Right. And not officially, but it's the ugliest face of Judaism, but it is a face. It is one face of Judaism. And so what we're seeing is the exact opposite of that appeal. That was really an appeal for religious people to try, in the conflict, to try to find a shared language of devotion. And that's what the journey that I went on into Islam and Palestinian Islam and Christianity that was the purpose, was to see whether I could find a way to speak to religious Palestinians as a fellow believer. And today, I deeply believe that. I believe if there's any chance for a future in the Middle East, a shared future, it will have to include some religious component. Right now, it's impossible to see clearly.
I mean, let's be clear. There are things done in the name of God, and then there is
God.
There's God. and then there is God. There is religion with spiritual and intellectual and aesthetic substance, right? Content.
Yeah.
Something that I just want to say, I've never said this to you before, but I'm thinking about how there's something so fervent in that book that you wrote and in your spiritual journey and really stretching yourself to see the other. I'm going to just read a little bit of what I think you said, I think this is from the transcript. You said, if I had to define what my real spiritual struggle is living in Jerusalem in these last 5 years, it's holding on to both those sensibilities and very often losing the balance, then being forced to remind myself that I also have a religious commitment not only to protect Israel and stand strong against what I see as an attack on my very being, but also to remember the dignity of Palestinians, the dignity of Islam, and to remind myself of the love that I felt, not just the respect that I felt for Islam in the mosque when I got on my knees and joined the Muslim prayer line. You wore a kippah in Gaza, but really the tremendous sense of gratitude to Islam for making the experience of prayer and surrender to God so overwhelming.
Wow.
But Yossi, something else I want to say to you that I think I see now is this journey for you, and this is the Jewish journey also, is really stretching yourself to see and also longing to be seen.
Yeah, so the question for me really is who is the Jewish people? Who are we supposed to be after this? We're carrying this unbelievably complicated story. And I always had this sense growing up, and I feel it even more so today, that our generation is the heir of not just this thousands of year story, but of the fulfillment of the greatest nightmare that the Jews carried, which was the Holocaust, followed by the fulfillment of the greatest dream that the Jews carried, which was the return to Israel. And that our generation somehow needs to make sense of this. And that's how I've always seen my life as a Jewish writer trying to tell this story, as an Israeli citizen, and as a spiritual seeker. And for me, the great tension in Jewish history is between the tribal and the universal. And that keeps playing out over and over again in our history. And every so often there's this outbreak. I mean, Christianity, was an outbreak from within Judaism of Jews saying, we can't keep this to ourselves anymore. This is the moment. This is the moment that the prophets imagined, and now and the other Jews said, not yet, not yet. That was the big, and
that's a really interesting analysis of the origins of Christianity.
But I mean,
You heard it here
I see it in purely tribal Jewish terms. So, and this tension that we carry, and that's what defines the tension within the Jewish people today. It's in large part a tension between Jerusalem and San Francisco. And so there's this sense of who are we, what's our purpose? And I believe that we are a people that was founded for a universal purpose. And it's there at the origins of our story. It's there in the founding of the Jewish story when God tells Abraham, leave your pagan world, separate, and I'm starting a new people. But then 2 verses later, God explains to Abraham the reason for being extracted from the non-Jewish world. Your descendants will be a blessing to the families to the families of the earth. And so there's this tension that's built into our origins of separation, of a very specific tribal identity, whose purpose is to serve the world. And how do we navigate that? How do we, and then that tension in itself is confusing. Then when you factor in this history of persecution and otherness, and then you have the state of Israel, whose purpose the founders of the state deeply believed that this was going to be the solution to anti-Semitism, to Jewish otherness. Right. That we needed to separate, especially after the Holocaust, we needed to separate, to heal on our own, and to become part of the family of nations. But the problem, and this is something that I'm appreciating more and more, that the Jewish reclamation of sovereignty and power, and that this idea that we would become part of the family of nations by having a state, was accompanied from the very beginning by repeated attempts to destroy this country. And so we've internalized this struggle of, do we belong to the family of nations, or are we eternally other? This government, if this government has any philosophy, and it does, it has a theology. It's the theology of eternal, immutable Jewish otherness. Yeah. And that's what I find so dangerous. But since October 7th, and that's what I've spent most of my life fighting against, right, because I have that very deeply in me. Since October 7th, this is what's overwhelming so many Israelis for sure are there, but even I think many Jews in the diaspora as well. And that's what I feel we need to struggle against, that despair that we're not part, and I think it's anti-Zionist to say that we were destined to be a people apart and to be ghettoized. We did not create the state of Israel to self-ghettoize.
Right. I think about, I don't know if we have questions coming or, okay. I think about how in that piece that you wrote before October 7th, you identified the wounds of aloneness and otherness as the root traumas, and how, when I have heard, it seems like right now, it seems like Netanyahu, I hear him using these things as battle cry, right?
He's cynically feeding on this.
But I'm just thinking, what is that? We're here to talk about the Israeli psyche, the Israeli soul, right? Like, what is that doing to people inside?
Yeah. Israelis are generally a people that really embrace the world. Israelis love to travel. They're the most passionate travelers. Israelis aren't tourists. They're pilgrims to the world, you know, and there's this sense of excitement, you know, we can go anywhere and we'll be accepted. The other day, there was a segment on Israel's leading satirical program called It's a Wonderful Country. And it's very funny program, and very irreverent. And they had a segment showing an Israeli meeting with a tourist, no, how do you say it in English? A travel agent, thank you. And the Israeli, the potential traveler saying to the travel agent, where is it safe for me to go? And the travel agent smiles and says, I have the perfect package for you. And she shows him a brochure of a trip to Mars. and that was the expression on the deepest level of the wound of October 7th. This fear that we are ostracized again. We really are other. And so you look at this government, and this government is feeding on that moment and encouraging it. And there is something self-fulfilling about it, not entirely, but there is something. There is a dynamic there. And so that's what this is doing to Israelis. Are we, to put it in the most elemental way, are we still part of humanity? Are the Jews part of humanity? And after the Holocaust, my father and many other survivors had the strong sense that we're not really part of humanity. And Israel helped the Jews heal in that way. It did help, and American Jewry, the two flags on the bima of American synagogues. Those are the two symbols of the healing of the Jewish people after the Holocaust, that we really have a place in the world. And post-October 7th, that's the question that's opening up.
Okay, so we have questions here for 4 hours, and we have 20 minutes. But what I'm seeing, not surprisingly, is are variations on some of the same questions. So I think I'm just going to go with some of these and see where we get. You know, recently I was listening to, I think is his name, Haviv Gur.
He's
talking,
terrific.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I wonder, yeah, I was very moved, and I felt illuminated by some of the things he talks about. He's also an Israeli journalist, right? And talking about how America was historically this unique place in the diaspora, which, because of civil rights, which he says is part of the reason American Jews have been so passionate about civil rights, this otherness dissipated. Mm-hmm. That Jews here were American and not really in the diaspora, which I wonder also if that dynamic is at play now in the very complex responses and reactions. But here's this question that came in. The American Jewish community had a love affair with liberalism for 150 years, and for good reason. With how American liberalism has responded after October 7th, is it time to revisit this affair?
So, first to your previous comment, I still believe in American exceptionalism for the Jews, and despite what's playing out, and I was on half a dozen campuses recently, the most Jewishly problematic campuses from Columbia to Berkeley, and I still uphold the promise and the fulfillment of the promise here. what does worry me, I hear a great deal of pessimism from American Jews, and I think you do too, Krista. And I even hear some Jews say, more Jews of my generation say, is this Germany of the 1930s? And we really can't go there. I do fear that American Jews might be moving toward the America of my parents' generation, which was an America that extended safety to the Jews and a home, but conditional acceptance. And what conditional acceptance meant was that tone down the Jewish. Don't talk with your hands. Maybe it's not such a bad idea to change your last name. And of course, you can be Jewish, but not in that way. And over the last few generations, the conditionality of America's acceptance of its Jews began to end. And I saw that. I moved to Israel in 1982, and with each visit back, I saw more and more of American Jewish at-homeness. And I celebrated that, because I felt that, the way that we put it at the Shalom Hartman Institute is that the Jewish people went from no home to 2 homes. And I think that's a beautiful formulation. And what worries me now is that progressive spaces are reviving the conditionality of Jewish acceptance. And what progressives are saying to Jewish kids on campus is, we have no problem with you as a Jew. We accept you. And I think that most of the anti-Zionism on campus is not necessarily anti-Semitic, even though it is in service of what I would describe as an anti-Semitic moment. But the conditionality of acceptance is telling these kids, there's just one thing you have to change. You can keep your name, you can be as Jewish as you want, just you have to give up Zionism, you have to give up Israel. And the message to young Jews is there's something not quite right with the Jews, you just need to fix it. And the psychological consequence of that is to encourage Jewish insecurity. And I remember my parents and their friends, when they would speak in public, if they said the word Jew, they would lower their voices. Didn't matter about what. And I used to call it the American Jewish whisper. And that's coming back. It's coming back through progressive spaces. So that's a long kind of way of segueing into this question. I think that American Jews need to stand up for liberalism, genuine liberalism. Liberalism right now is under assault from the right and from the left. And classical liberalism ranges from moderate conservatives to moderate left. There's a very broad spectrum under the umbrella of liberal. The American Jewish community became the most successful diaspora in Jewish history because of liberalism. And this is a moment, a very uncomfortable moment for American Jews, because the American Jewish community became successful by not being confrontational. The movement that I was involved in as a teenager, the Jewish Defense League, was an aberration which American Jewish memory has erased. It never happened. And I understand why that moment had to be pushed under the rug, because it was such an antithetical expression of how American Jews have adjusted to America. We were so confrontational, we were so in your face. And this is a moment that is calling for American Jews to become confrontational. And it is so counterintuitive to all of the instincts of the American Jewish community. But you have no choice, because the progressives are giving you no choice and the far right are giving you no choice, but to stand up and defend America, defend this imperfect, place that has been a blessing for the Jews, like no other country ever. And Jews owe that to America. We owe America gratitude, and we owe America an affirmation of its best self. And that means really defending liberalism and standing against the left and the far left and the far right. I think I better write that as an article.
Yeah. So I think there's a question. It's also been in my notes about. I think I wrote to you the other day saying I just read this op-ed. Oh, it was about Israel is hardening, right? I actually thought it was interesting earlier, a little while ago. You said you're freezing, and that's a whole different thing. And also such a generalization, right? So the question is, is the American press failing? I think that, the question about what is missing. I think if to kind of put this in terms of counsel you would give us, what to be looking for. What do we just need to know that we're not going to get?
Krista, this falls for me under the category of don't get me started.
Don't get you started. And then, someone else said last week, the New York Times started this huge series on how the right wing in Israel has supported the settler movement and highlighted the inconsistencies in policing the West Bank. And, this question, how can American Jews support Israel while recognizing these politicians don't align with our values? And I think that also all comes back to how information is flowing and what is known and what is not known.
Yeah. A lot of questions. First of all, in terms of the media, for me, the template of how the media, how much of the media was going to get this story wrong happened very soon after the beginning of the war, when there was the incident at Al-Shifa Hospital. And the New York Times ran with a banner headline 2 hours after the incident. It was on their website. 500 reported dead in Israeli missile strike on hospital, Palestinians say. But 500 reported dead in Israeli missile strike on hospital. That was the headline. That was the impression. Now, as a former journalist, my first question was, how do you know that it's 500? If a missile hits a building, it will take days to recover the dead and the wounded. But there was the headline, and most of the media went with it. That became the number, 500. And then eventually it came out that it was not an Israeli missile, and it wasn't 500. But the way in which so much of the media has gotten this story wrong is by aligning itself with justice rather than truth. And the job of the media, I was schooled by the last generation of old-fashioned journalists. I went to journalism school in the 1970s, and my teachers were people who really believed in the imperfect and unattainable quest for truth.
Well, let me ask you this, though. So, numbers, right? Don't trust the numbers, which I think it's okay. But what questions are they not even asking?
It's not. It's more the narrative that there's this consensus around narrative, which is we saw it beginning on October 8th, which was, yes, this was a terrible event that happened, but let's not forget the context. This is an occupied people. This is an act of desperation. Obama said it after October 7th. The UN Secretary General said it, and they all dutifully condemned the massacre. What has been missed, and maybe this is really an answer to your question, is the lens through which Israelis see this war, this is not a war against Hamas alone, and it's certainly not a war against the Palestinian people. This is a war against radical Islamism. And October 7th and this was a consensus in Israel, including on most of the left, that October 7th was not about the occupation. Because for Hamas, even if a Palestinian state existed, the potential of an October 7th would have remained. For Hamas, this was about creating a mini scenario for the destruction of Israel. That's how we understood it. And that has not been conveyed. You know, it's Israel versus Hamas. Lebanon, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, we're fighting a five-front war. And that's how we experience this. So there really is this sense of, I don't recognize the war that I'm in when I read much of foreign coverage. Mm-hmm. It's not the same war. Now, that also plays in reverse. You know, what I feel here, I'm winding down a 3-month lecture tour here. And what I've experienced here often is that the discourse around the war in Gaza, it's as if there's no Hamas there. Israel is declaring war against the civilian population. But the reverse is also true in Israel. The discourse there is often as if there are no civilians in Gaza. It's all Hamas. Mm. And there's this radical disconnect. And why is it so? And that's true, by the way, for much of the Israeli media, which has not done its job either. The Israeli media is not showing the Israeli public what you see here from Gaza. So I'm speaking now as a journalist. I want my Israeli media to act like a real media. Ask hard questions. Why, for example, did Israel have to be forced into taking seriously the food crisis in Gaza? That should have been our responsibility. We caused that crisis. Now, before you applaud, let me say the rest of what I have to say, because you may not agree. We had no choice but to create the circumstances in which that food crisis came about. But we had the responsibility to address the food crisis. And it should not have been the responsibility of Biden to force us into our basic human responsibility for taking care of this crisis. So, but these are questions that my media isn't asking. Yeah. So I look at these two medias and say, why are you both getting this wrong?
Writ large.
Yes, yeah. They're taking sides. I don't want journalists to take sides.
Yeah. So I'm going to bring this back here, but I'm going to kind of weave some of what's in here into my final questions for you. Yeah, you mentioned that Israel is ripe for a spiritual awakening. What might that look like? How do you think that might come about? I guess in the more immediate term, obviously related to that, you know, this profound experience you had of this kind of pilgrimage of prayer, which deepened your Jewish identity and your Jewish, I don't want to use the word faith, spirituality.
But yes, definitely, yeah. Definitely.
I think faith is kind of a Christian word, but
no.
Yeah, and even the mystical, right?
Faith.
It was a mystical experience. So even, you know, given what you just said, which is living in this very hard world and condoning very hard actions and policies, and what is with you? What can be with you? What is there to reach for in this spiritual, mystical intelligence, even both that can accompany you and us in this time, but also thinking about walking into the beyond of this?
You know, Micha Goodman, the Israeli writer and philosopher, described October 7th as an out-of-body experience for Israel. It was a near-death experience. And when you have a near-death experience, and that is the most precise description of what it feels like to be an Israeli today. We are a little bit disembodied. Everything feels a little unreal. I never know what date it is. I don't know what date today is. And I've been on a lecture tour. It's very difficult being on a lecture tour. Sometimes I literally forget what month it is. And when you've gone through that kind of experience, the comfort of daily routine is denied you. You are now in potentially in a mystical place. Now, not everyone is going to go there, but I think many people will. And there was also the experience of all of us in Israel lost people, everyone. And to lose people collectively at the same moment. And so I see this really as and now I'll speak specifically within Judaism. The greatest spiritual flaw in Israeli Judaism is that we imported the Judaism of the ghetto, the Judaism that was developed over 2,000 years of fear of the other. And we've imported, that is official Judaism in the state of Israel. That's the Orthodox establishment in Israel, is that Judaism. And this government is the political reflection of that theology. This is a moment where we can finally begin asking ourselves, what should the Judaism of a free people in its land look like? What should be our relationship to the other? Now, right now, Israelis are in no mood to ask the question of what is our relationship to the Palestinians.
You know, it's not even, it's like, if you are living out of a fear place, any of us is living out of a fear place, that's almost too much to ask.
So
some people will be able to do it, but everyone won't.
Right.
I just want to say that.
Right.
Just like physiologically.
So when I look at where I think Israeli society is heading in, we've been heading in a more religious direction since the Second Intifada, since the time of the suicide bombings. And you see it most clearly in Israeli music. The Israeli musicians are the ones who intuit where the society is going. In Israeli music, on the whole, is just magnificent. And there's this growing sense of we can't go on in a purely material existence. It doesn't explain our reality in Israel anymore. And I feel that the two expressions that have defined Israeli society, secularism on the one hand and ghetto orthodoxy on the other, are both running their course. They're both inadequate to answer the needs of Israelis. And so I think we're coming into an extraordinary moment in the history of Judaism where and this happens every few centuries. There's some upheaval, spiritual upheaval in Judaism. There was the Kabbalistic movement. There was the Hasidic movement. We are overdue for a spiritual upheaval. And I feel that coming. And if you're asking, what is the intelligence that people can bring to the spiritual intelligence? Yeah. It's that experience of intimacy with death, which Israelis have always carried, but we were able to compartmentalize. Okay, we go through wars, and then we return to the pretense of normal life. Israelis were masters at maintaining daily life. That's over. I don't think this generation is going to be capable of just normal life anymore. And that can have all kinds of negative consequences, but it's also the grounds for spiritual wisdom. It's realizing that, we're kind of sleepwalkers. And we go through our lives denying the most important fact of our life, which is we don't know what this is about, and it's going to end soon for each of us. And Israelis now, what I've just described is a normative condition now in Israel. It is part of the Israeli psyche of everyone I know, whether they're spiritual or not. So some, I believe, will take this in the direction of a search for wisdom.
I'm not sure how this fits in here, but I want to mention it. I was looking back at my notes of our conversations, and you said somewhere that events that happened 100 or 200 years ago are considered virtually contemporary here. I feel like there's a sense of time, which is more biblical and actually more in line with how Einstein saw time than the Newtonian clock world. With this illusion that the past and the present and the future are separate. There's no place on earth where it's more vividly visible that past, present, and future are constantly interacting than Israel, Palestine.
Yeah, really for both sides. I think that's true. For Muslims as well as Jews. Yeah.
I think somehow that is helpful because right now, living as we do and then with the 24/7 news cycle, it's just impossible to imagine a beyond of this, right? And I feel like, it's something you said. You've talked about Israelis needing the apocalyptic scenarios that were the poles between which Israeli life was functioning, needing a vision, needing to create a vision of healing. And I think what you just described is a crucible of that this becomes a crucible of that. I think there's a question in this room about how American Jews can be part of that, support that, and also a question, and maybe you just you were walking into this answer about, what is giving you hope now? Where does hope come from for you?
I believe that God is in this story. I think God is in all the stories. But in some way, God seems to be especially intensively in this story. There are some religious Jews who take that to mean that we have divine protection to act as badly as everybody else. And that's also an expression of the theology of this government. But what gives me hope is that God didn't give up on the Jews. And it's interesting to go back to Christianity, is that contemporary Christian theology towards the Jews and Judaism has come to terms with the fact that God actually did not end the divine involvement with the Jewish story 2,000 years ago. And that's one of the most extraordinary theological transformations that any religion has ever gone through in its relationship to another religion. The way that so much of Christianity had the courage to rethink a fundamental principle about the place of the Jews in its understanding. And so I feel that God has some purpose for the Jewish people. We can't be carrying this story in all of its complexity, especially at this moment in human history. And what gives me hope in a strange way is that this is not just about the Jews. This is a moment where the whole world, Elie Wiesel once said, the whole world is now Jewish. And he meant the nuclear threat, that existential dread is now built in to humanity. We now have the capacity to destroy ourselves.
Well, and we have brought our planet to a place of
Yes,
to the
we've
brink
done
of
that.
destruction.
And so the question that interests me the most now is, what do the Jews have to say? We are history's great survivors. What do we have to say? What is the meaning of this story? What do we bring to the world at a moment when the world needs the wisdom of its ancient peoples? Whether it's Aborigine peoples, I think of India, which has maintained a kind of unbroken continuity with its most ancient roots. China kind of lost that sense of continuity. But the Jews are one of those few peoples that remember everything. You know, it's part of our problem. We never forget a thing. But we have this extraordinary continuous memory of the human experience filtered through the Jewish experience. And what does it mean? What do we have to say to the world? And that, for me, that's the most important question. So I don't know, I can't say so much about hope. It's not, truthfully, I think I'm too much of an Israeli at this point. I don't think in categories of hope or despair. I don't feel despair. So I guess that by default I feel hope. But it's more a question of, what do we need to do? What is our responsibility as carriers? We are the ones who've made it to the end of this story. Yeah, and what do we do with this story? For ourselves, for our kids, what do we tell them? What do we tell ourselves? And what do we have to say to a desperate world? And it gets even more complicated when it seems to us that the world is turning on us again. So the instinct of most Israelis now, if I raise that question, is, are you out of your mind? Who cares about them? They hate us. And so we need, and that's what, if you ask about the role of American Jews, you are the product of the Jewish people's most successful interaction with non-Jews in our history. And you can't lose that. We really need that, especially now. We need our friends. We need that sense of openness and possibility. And American Jewry should not freeze up. You know, you use your distance from Israel, your geographical distance, to have a little bit of objectivity. And don't take on the full trauma of what we're caught in. And help us, be our partners, stand with Israel. I hope that American Jews will continue to stand with us, but also challenge us, and we need to be challenged. So that's where I see American Jews fitting in.
Yossi, it's been such an honor, and it's been wonderful to continue this conversation with you. And
Totally mutual.
I hope this was meaningful. It was meaningful for me.
Very much so for me.
It feels like a healing space in this room somehow.
Yeah.
So thank you all for coming, and thank you.
Krista. Thank you all very much.
How do you feel?